Okay, part 7, I think. John Dewey, also written by Alex Newman in the Epic Times. When humanist, red flag, John Dewey and his disciples took over the emerging government education system created decades earlier to advance collectivism, the fledgling machine was still in its infancy. By the time he died in 1952, though, it was a well-oiled collectivist machine that would obliterate America's religious, intellectual, and political heritage more effectively than any force previously imagined. Dewey wanted to fundamentally transform the United States. Sound familiar? He wanted it to look more like the Soviet Union, in fact. To do that, he believed a total transformation of education and society was required, literally changing the conception of what constitutes education, as he wrote in the relation of theory to practice in education in 1904. Education must bring about a new social order. Now, obviously, when he wrote this, there was no Soviet Union. He's talking about later on in his life, when he did comment favorably upon the Soviet Union. He also rejected the individualism and liberty that defined America up to that point. Rejected it? With its strong protections for God-given rights, private property, and free markets, God forbid. Instead, Dewey worked fiendishly to continue the severing of American and Western education's Christian roots. The process was launched by Owen, the Welsh communist whose commune in Indiana failed. It formally took root under Mann in Massachusetts when he imported the Owen-inspired Prussian model of education. That was just the beginning. By the time Dewey and his disciples worked their magic, the scheme would culminate in a nation where the overwhelming majority of high school seniors violently reject the biblical worldview and where most young people describe themselves as socialist. On top of that, the system would produce a nation in which less than a third of those same seniors would even be considered proficient in reading and math, as we've discussed, according to federal data gathered from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which we covered. He's from Vermont, Bernie's old stomping grounds there, and like Bernie Sanders, Dewey styled himself a democratic socialist, oxymoronically as it may be. But many decades before Sanders visited the Soviet Union on his honeymoon, while it was slaughtering and torturing dissidents, Dewey made a pilgrimage to Moscow under Bolshevik rule. Of course, Marx called for government control of education in the Communist Manifesto, and so the Soviets complied. Decades earlier, Owen, another communist, did the same. Dewey picked up where they left off, fervently advocating total control of all education by the state with even more passion than Sanders does today. Writing in the far-left magazine New Republic, it still is, by the way, far left, Dewey provided glowing reports about the communist system being imposed upon the people of the Soviet Union. He was especially pleased with its so-called education system, celebrating the way it was instilling a collectivist mentality in Soviet children. In his Impressions of Soviet Russia and the Revolutionary World, published in 1929. Despite his fondness for, Dewey would publicly criticize Stalin and Stalinism later in his life. His model for a communist United States, by contrast, was outlined in Edward Bellamy's 1888 book, Looking Backward, a fantasy about a wonderful collectivist America in the year 2000, where all private property would be nationalized by government. Dewey understood that the education of children would be fundamental to achieving his utopian vision of collectivism. Education, he said, is a regulation of the process of coming to share in the social consciousness, the adjustment of individual liberty or activity on the basis of this social consciousness is the only sure method of social reconstruction. In his important 1898 essay, The Primary Education Fetish, Dewey argued strongly against the then heavy emphasis on reading, writing, and arithmetic in the younger years. It produced highly literate, independent-minded individualists with faith in God and freedom. That was not conducive, however, to a collectivist utopia, obviously. An astute operator, Dewey recognized that the liberty-minded and overwhelmingly Christian teachers, taxpayers, and parents of America of that era would never knowingly support his radical educational and political ambitions if they understood them. Change must come gradually. Hello, slippery slope. Even then. He explained in the same essay, to force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. That's right. You can't shove it all down their throats. You got to make them agree to it little by little, and then they look back and go, how the hell did we get here? How many times have I said this? Nothing new under the sun. Once again. So instead of going to the American people, Dewey instead went to the Rockefeller oil dynasty, which was giving away unfathomable, that's a hard word for me, I don't know why, amounts of money for educational reform through the General Education Board. The philanthropic outfit gave Dewey millions of dollars to create an experimental school to try out his ideas. A school that successfully cranked out reading disabled collectivists. Congratulations. Dewey's efforts to seize control of the school system began with a leadership position in education at Rockefeller-funded University of Chicago. The purpose of this, my words here, the purpose of this laboratory was to see what kind of curriculum would produce socialists instead of capitalists, collectivists instead of individuals. The ideal classroom is a psych lab, and students are lab animals. From his ivory tower perch, Dewey would train up legions of teachers and disciples to unleash on an unsuspecting United States and carry forward his vision. It worked. Dewey became the founding father of America's progressive public education system, and his ideology went mainstream. In fairness to Dewey, he did not have the 20th century in the rearview mirror. It might be said in their defense that, or his defense, that he could not have known the ideology of collectivism, when implemented, would lead to the untimely deaths and mass slaughter of hundreds of millions of people. Russia, China. Now we should know better. Now we should know better. Which brings us to socialists have used public schools to destroy literacy in America, also by our friend Alex Newman at the Epoch Times. Americans were almost certainly the most literate people on the planet in the 1700s and the 1800s. In fact, the earliest settlers in Massachusetts, the Puritans, were so passionate about reading that in the 1640s, they passed the Old Deluder Satan Act, mandating that everyone learn to read. The thinking was that without knowledge of the Bible, the devil would be more easily able to deceive their communities. And so it was understood that every town must strive for universal literacy. Hey, whatever gets you there, get you there. The passion for literacy translated into what would become the most literate society that mankind had ever produced up to that time. According to University of Montana scholar Kenneth Lockridge's study, literacy in colonial New England, 90% were literate by 1800, with numbers approaching 100% literacy in cities like Boston. 1800. Even among women, that was true. According to estimates by Joe Perlman of Bard College and Dennis Shirley of Boston College, virtually all women born in the 1800s were literate. At the time, Americans realized that as well. In his groundbreaking 1812 study, National Education in the United States of America, Dupont de Nemours estimated that even among young people, not more than 4 in 1,000 are unable to write legibly, even neatly. And in 1800, the Boston Review reported that no other nation in the world had a larger percentage of its population with at least basic literary skills, literacy skills, and an understanding of the rudiments of science. Well, yay us. By the middle of the 20th century, everything changed. A crisis of literacy was brewing that is without precedent in the history of the world. Literacy rates began plummeting, particularly after World War II. And today, the government's own data shows evidence of a catastrophic decline in reading. In 1993, the U.S. government conducted the most comprehensive literacy study ever performed up to that time. And the results were shocking. On September 9th of that year, 1993, citing the study, the Boston Globe reported that nearly half of Americans read and write so poorly that it is difficult for them to hold a decent job. Many other analysts concluded, based on the findings, that almost half of the nation was either illiterate or at least very close to functional illiteracy. Another federal study performed a decade later found similar results. The numbers are even worse in certain areas and among America's youth. According to the federal government's most recent National Assessment of Educational Progress, only about 1/3 of high school seniors are proficient in reading, as we've stated. And in Washington, D.C., a recent state education agency report revealed that 2/3 of the adult population is functionally illiterate, falling to 50% in some wards. In response, top D.C. officials took a trip to communist Cuba to see how that murderous regime educates children. That ought to fix the problem. The root of the problem stems from the method used to teach reading. The writing system in English is based on phonetic characters, meaning Arabic, Latin, English, going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, each letter representing one or more audible sounds, like phonetic. Yeah. So from the time the writing system was developed thousands of years ago by the Phoenicians, teaching an individual how to read involved giving a student the knowledge to sound out letters, blend them together, and then decode words. Reverend Thomas Gallaudet of Connecticut, after learning from a French minister in Paris, pioneered a new system. It would come to be known variously as the whole word method, the look-say method, or the sight-word method. For deaf children, this was an enormous leap forward, which is what it was meant to do. The look-say or whole word method is like reading Chinese or Egyptian hieroglyphics. Just a few short months after being selected to serve as the Commonwealth's first ever Secretary of Education in 1837, Horace Mann, a collectivist who seemed always ready to embrace quackery, would oversee the instruction of this new system into the government primary schools of Boston. It was an unmitigated disaster. Basically, children suddenly struggled to learn how to read, with many of them displaying symptoms that today would be diagnosed as dyslexia. The schoolmasters of Boston joined forces to expose and repudiate the quackery before it did more damage. In a stinging paper, over 30 school chiefs wrote that such a change as that proposed by Mr. Mann and others is neither called for nor sustained by sound reasoning. The critical comments made in the remarks on the 7th annual report of the Honorable Horace Mann pointed out that many of the arguments made in support of the whole word method were fallacious and based upon false premises. Others were irrelevant. By 1844, the method was thrown out of the school system entirely. While Mann may have genuinely believed that the whole word method would work, it appears very likely that Dewey suffered from under no such delusions. Dewey used the method on children in his experimental school in Chicago, with results similar to those obtained in Boston generations earlier. Children unable to read properly. In fact, he said children in the early grades were better off not receiving such instruction, such instruction at all, in the so-called 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Dewey said that they're better off not learning reading, writing, and arithmetic. But after World War II, school districts across the United States, many influenced by Dewey and his minions, started buying up the books that he wrote and others, and imposing the whole word method on millions of innocent students. Literacy rates promptly collapsed. By 1950s, the crisis was so serious that the public was starting to ask questions. What's going on? And in 1955, Rudolf Flesch published his explosive book, Why Johnny Can't Read, blowing the lid off the quackery. The teaching of reading all over the United States, in all the schools, in all the textbooks, is totally wrong and flies in the face of all logic and common sense, he explained, lambasting the whole word method in the literacy crisis it produced. The ensuing scandal caused many schools to restore traditional phonics instruction. But the utopian advocates of reading quackery did not go away. In 1981, by the way, Flesch had to write, Why Johnny Still Can't Read. Less than 20 years after Flesch exposed them, legendary educator and reading expert Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld would expose them to, again, in The New Illiterates. In the book, he systematically analyzed the most common reading primers then in use in the United States, highlighting the problems and showing the enormous damage being done to children. Incredibly, some especially unhinged educators argue that teaching children to read properly was all part of a vast right-wing conspiracy. Now, brain scans performed with new technology have actually shown the damage being done to the physical brains of children victimized by this quackery. Dr. Stanislas Dehaene, director of the Cognitive Neuroimaging Unit at Saclay in France, demonstrated the harm and explained that reading must be taught by systematically teaching children the correspondence between sounds and letters. The education establishment pretended not to notice. Today, key elements of the whole word method still haunt public schools across the U.S., often under new terminology such as balanced literacy and guided reading. Under the National Common Core education standards imposed on the U.S. by former President B. Obama, Kindergarten children are even required to memorize sight words. This causes a whole word reflex to develop that can produce lifelong reading disabilities, despite having a bit of phonics mixed in. Perhaps more incredibly, even though the methods have been totally discredited since the 1840s, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, claims children all over the world should still learn a sight vocabulary. Consider people who cannot read readily educate themselves. People who cannot read cannot readily educate themselves. They are much easier to control and manipulate. And perhaps that is the point. With man, it's entirely possible that this was an innocent mistake. Certainly, that's true of most teachers in the United States today, as well who have not been trained to teach reading properly. But the fact that this giant mistake continues to be supported by education establishment to this day, and that it always seems to be socialists, communists, and collectivists pushing it, suggests that there is something much more nefarious, a nefarious agenda at work here. We'll close this thing up and part 1 million in the next part. See you then.